Welcome to the Deep Dive. You've brought us a really fascinating and I think often misunderstood topic today, polygamy, and its complicated place in the Bible.
Yeah, it really is. It's a subject that definitely challenges some modern assumptions.
It does, and the sources you've shared, wow, they give us some incredibly rich stuff to explore here.
Exactly. So our mission today really is to navigate these ancient texts, try to understand the cultural context, and look at the different interpretations.
Yeah.
We want to figure out what the Bible actually describes, what it might prohibit, and maybe most importantly, what it ultimately prescribes about marriage.
Right.
It's a journey, I think, into the heart of biblical understanding. It goes way beyond just simple black and white answers.
That mission really gets at the core tension, doesn't it? Especially when you think about how many conservative Christians today believe so firmly that marriage is strictly one man, one woman.
They often cite scripture, particularly against things like same-sex marriage.
Exactly. But then when you look at polygamy through a biblical lens, like our sources do, the answer isn't quite as straightforward, at least not right away.
No, it definitely isn't. It's complex.
So let's dive into that. Looking at the Old Testament, one of the maybe surprising things our sources show is just how common polygamy actually was. Or specifically, polygyny, one man marrying multiple women.
Yeah, and among some really central figures, too.
Can you walk us through some of those examples, the big ones?
Sure. It's quite striking, really. Our sources point us right back to Genesis. Genesis 4.1 Lamech, described as the first polygamist. He had 2 women.
Right at the beginning.
Yeah. And then you get Abraham, a patriarch of faith, right?
Ew.
He had Sarah, but also Hagar and later Keturah.
Okay.
Then there's Jacob. He married sisters Leah and Rachel and also had children with their handmaids, Bilhah and Zilpah, often seen as concubines, really.
Wow. And it doesn't stop there.
Not at all. King David, multiple wives and concubines. And King Solomon, I mean, the numbers are just staggering. 700 wives and 300 concubines.
700 wives.
It's hard to even imagine. And these weren't minor characters. These were, often seen as the great men of faith in the Old Testament.
So it wasn't just something that happened on the fringes. Our sources even suggest the law of God itself, the Torah, actually included provisions for families structured this way.
That's right. It seems the law implicitly allowed it, or at least acknowledged it, by regulating it.
How so? What kind of regulations are we talking about?
Well, for example, Exodus 21.0, it says if a man takes a second wife, he absolutely must not cut back on the first wife's food, clothing, or marital rights.
Okay, so protecting the first wife.
Exactly. And then Deuteronomy 21, verses 15 to 17, lays out really specific inheritance rules for the firstborn son, even if his mother was the unloved wife.
Which implies these situations were common enough to need clear legal handling.
Precisely. It shows a legal framework was in place to navigate these relationships, which suggests they existed and were, in a way, accommodated by the system.
Now, there's one passage our sources highlight that is particularly startling. God himself, speaking through Nathan the prophet to David.
Ah, yes. 2 Samuel 12.8. It's powerful.
It really is. God says, I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. What do we make of that?
It's a complex statement. It strongly suggests that, at least in David's specific context, polygamy wasn't just tolerated, but was actually something God could provide or even bless.
It really complicates the picture, doesn't it? It shows it wasn't just a blanket no.
Definitely. It adds layers to understanding how it was viewed back then.
Okay, so it was prevalent, even accommodated in the law, maybe even blessed in some specific cases. But, and this is where it gets really interesting from our sources, the Bible also seems to consistently show the downsides, the negative consequences.
Absolutely. The texts don't paint a rosy picture at all. It wasn't just a historical fact. It was often a source of deep problems.
What kinds of problems jump out from the narratives?
Well, several things. First, you see constant strife and favoritism. Think about Jacob's wives, Leah and Rachel. Their story is just full of rivalry, jealousy, competition.
Yeah, you can feel the tension.
Definitely. Or Elkanah's wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah constantly provoking Hannah. It's heartbreaking.
Right. And us.
Second, there's often a link to domestic unhappiness and even outright sin. Abraham taking Hagar, for instance. It's presented right after his failure to fully trust God's promise about Sarah.
Interesting connection.
And David. Despite having many wives, he clearly wasn't content. That leads directly to the adultery with Bathsheba. Nathan's parable later really nails him for covetousness, wanting more, even when he had plenty.
He wasn't satisfied.
No. And third, specifically for kings, multiplying wives was explicit disobedience. King Solomon, with his hundreds of wives.
And we just mentioned.
Exactly. He directly violated the command in Deuteronomy 17, which warned kings not to multiply wives, horses, or gold. It wasn't just bad policy, it was a spiritual issue. Kings were supposed to trust God, Yahweh, not build security through, political marriages with foreign nations.
That's such a crucial point about the consequences and the disobedience, especially for leaders. So it really begs the question, if it caused so much strife and was even forbidden for kings, why did God seem to allow it at all? This brings us to something really key in our sources, this distinction between what the Bible describes versus what it prescribes. Can you unpack that?
Yes, this is absolutely fundamental for reading the Bible well, I think. Descriptive texts just tell us what happened. They record events, actions, situations, but they don't automatically mean God endorses those things as the ideal.
So just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean it's promoted by the Bible.
Precisely. Prescriptive texts, on the other hand, tell us God's will. They give commands, principles for living. So Abraham, Jacob, David. They had multiple wives, that's described, but they were never commanded by God to do it.
Right.
In fact, God's foundational design, his prescription for marriage, is laid out right back in Genesis 2. One man, one woman, becoming one flesh.
The creation standard.
Exactly. And it's that standard, that prescription, which gets reaffirmed consistently in the New Testament by Jesus and Paul.
So why the allowance in the Old Testament then, even if temporary? What are the theories?
Well, one idea our sources mention is common grace. In that ancient world, life could be incredibly harsh, especially for women without a male provider.
Right, vulnerable.
Very. Single women, widows, they often face destitution. So polygamous marriage, in that context, might have been allowed as a sort of social safety net, a way to provide food, shelter, protection, an act of mercy almost within a fallen system.
A practical mercy.
Perhaps. Another angle, similar to how Jesus talks about divorce, is that maybe it was permitted because of human sinfulness, or hard-heartedness, as the Bible puts it. Jeremiah 17.9 talks about the heart being desperately wicked.
So not God's ideal, but a concession to human reality.
Sort of.
Yeah.
God regulated the practice, setting rules like we discussed, to try and maintain some order and protect the vulnerable within it. But it wasn't plan A. It wasn't his original perfect design.
It really clarifies things. It means we look up to figures like Abraham and David for their faith, which was often incredible, but not necessarily for every single action they took, especially regarding marriage.
Exactly. The Bible isn't hiding their flaws, nor is it promoting polygamy. It's showing the real, often messy consequences when people deviate from that Genesis 2 standard.
Okay, so that sets the stage for the Old Testament. Now let's fast forward. What happens when we get to the New Testament? How do Jesus and Paul address this? Does the perspective shift?
It definitely clarifies, I'd say. Jesus takes a very clear stance. Remember when the Pharisees tested him about divorce?
Yes, in the Gospels.
He uses that moment to pivot right back to God's original intent for marriage, back to creation. He quotes Genesis 1, male and female he created them, and Genesis 2, and the two shall become one flesh.
And our sources point out he specifically includes the word two.
He does, yeah. Mark 10, Matthew 19, it's explicit, the two. By doing that, he's actually aligning himself with some Jewish thinking of his time that was already pushing back against the wider acceptance of polygamy. Groups like the Essenes at Qumran, some Jews outside Palestine, they were already using these verses to argue for monogamy.
So Jesus wasn't necessarily introducing a brand new idea, but strongly reaffirming and clarifying the original one.
That's a good way to put it. And then Paul builds on that foundation in the early church.
How so?
Well, most notably, he gives instructions for church leadership. Elders, deacons, they must be, in his words, the husband of one wife. That's in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1.
And that wasn't just like a practical rule for scheduling or something?
Yeah. No. It seems much deeper than that. It was about setting the standard. These leaders were to model godliness, to embody the ideal for the whole church community. And that ideal was monogamy.
Okay, but then you have the question. If God permitted polygamy before, maybe as common grace or due to hard-heartedness, did Jesus and Paul just sort of change the rules, change God's commands?
That's a great question. And our sources suggest it's less about changing commands arbitrarily and more about consistently upholding God's eternal purpose for marriage.
Purpose over specific command.
Kind of. The specific commands or allowances might adapt to different situations, but the underlying purpose remains. And what is that purpose? Fundamentally, it's about helping people find mutual support, belonging, family. Psalm 68.6 says, God sets the lonely in families. That's the core idea.
So how did polygamy fit that purpose, even temporarily?
Well, think about those times of constant warfare we mentioned. Lots of men dying, leaving many widows and orphans. In that specific, difficult context, polygamy could, arguably, help fulfill the purpose by ensuring more women and children were cared for, helping society rebuild.
Okay, I can see that logic for a specific, harsh context.
But then, in more stable times, or as societies changed, that same practice could actually hinder the purpose. If wealthy men took multiple wives, it could leave many poorer men unable to marry at all, increasing loneliness and hindering that goal of universal family formation.
So the shift to emphasizing monogamy in the New Testament wasn't changing the purpose, but finding the best way to fulfill that purpose in a new context.
Exactly. It was applying the eternal purpose, setting the lonely in families to the realities of their time.
And we touched on this briefly, but enforcing monogamy created a ripple effect, right?
Yeah.
More unsupported widows in the early church.
It did. That was an unintended consequence. If a man who already had a wife converted, he couldn't just abandon her. But the church standard was moving towards monogamy, especially for leaders. And generally, fewer polygamous households meant potentially more single women without support.
So how did they handle that?
The church stepped up. They created systems to care for these women, the widows' lists or widows' associations mentioned in Acts and 1 Timothy. It wasn't perfect. There were challenges, like Paul addresses in 1 Timothy 5, but it was a concrete response. They recognized the need and trying to meet it collectively.
That's fascinating, seeing the theological principle lead to a practical, social response within the community. Okay, so let's bring this into the modern day.
Right.
How is polygamy viewed now, and what are the takeaways from our sources for today?
Well, today, in most Western cultures, polygamy is widely rejected and illegal. It's often classified as a crime, like bigamy. While you mentioned mainstream Mormons don't practice it anymore, some splinter groups do. And you find it practiced in some other contexts, too. Certain Muslim communities, some neo-pagan groups like Wiccans, and even some very liberal Christian fringes might be open to it.
And there's the term polyamory, too, which is maybe related but distinct.
Yeah, distinct but related. Polyamory usually refers to multiple consensual romantic or sexual relationships, not necessarily involving marriage in the legal or traditional religious sense. So it shares the multi-partner aspect, but the framework is different.
It's also interesting, as our sources note, that Judaism itself largely moved away from polygamy centuries ago.
That's right. Among Ashkenazi Jews, it was effectively banned around the 10th or 11th century by Rabbi Gershom ben Judah.
And the reasons were practical as well as ethical.
Largely practical, it seems. The financial burden of supporting multiple wives, often requiring separate households, was significant. Plus, just the inherent difficulties, the strife, the jealousy that we saw depicted way back in Genesis, it proved problematic over time.
So if we boil it all down, what's the core message from the Bible on this, looking across both testaments and considering God's purpose?
I think the consistent message is this. While the Bible doesn't have a single verse saying, "Thou shalt not ever have more than one wife" in the Old Testament law, it's overwhelmingly clear that polygamy is not God's original design or his ideal.
It consistently leads to problems.
Consistently. Strife, jealousy, sin, disobedience. It deviates from that Genesis 2:1 flesh standard. Paul's wisdom in 1 Corinthians comes to mind. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful or expedient. Just because something might have been permitted or regulated in a specific time doesn't mean it's wise or beneficial or that it builds people up.
And there's a deeper theological reason, too, related to marriage reflecting the gospel.
Absolutely. This is a profound point in the sources. Biblically, marriage is meant to be a picture, a metaphor for Christ and the church. The husband representing Christ, the wife representing the one church, his bride.
So polygamy messes up that picture.
It fundamentally disrupts it. It tears down that beautiful God-designed image of one groom and one bride. The monogamous structure upholds that picture.
And that structure is also seen as best for children.
Yes, providing that clear model of godliness, stability, and illustrating that image of Christ and the church within the home.
There's also the idea of God's own jealousy for his people.
Right. God describes himself as Israel's husband in the Old Testament, and he reacts with holy jealousy when Israel commits idolatry, which he calls adultery. He desires exclusive devotion. That divine jealousy mirrors, in a holy way, the exclusive commitment expected in a monogamous marriage.
It's easy maybe for us today to look back and feel a bit, smug about rejecting polygamy. We have laws against it, but our sources subtly challenge that, pointing out our own modern struggles with marriage, high divorce rates, widespread adultery. The statistics mentioned are sobering, like 13% of women, 20% of men admitting to adultery.
Yeah, achieving that lifelong, committed 1+1 relationship is still a huge challenge for us, isn't it? We might focus a lot on the wedding day, maybe even on the divorce process, but sometimes perhaps we don't focus enough on the actual day-to-day nurturing of the marriage itself.
That's a really thought-provoking point to end on.
This whole deep dive, it really shows how the Bible doesn't gloss over the messy parts of human history and behavior. It's all in there. But reflecting on our discussion, what really stands out to you about God's consistent purpose for marriage, even as the specific practices or allowances seem to shift?
For me, it's that powerful reminder that God's ultimate intention for marriage seems unwavering. That core purpose fostering mutual support, building families where people belong, and reflecting his own covenant love with his people that shines through constantly. The whole complex story of polygamy in the Bible, with all its difficulties and warnings, ultimately, I think, just reinforces the value and beauty of the monogamous ideal. It encourages us to really cherish and work at those one-man, one-woman marriages, striving for that standard that points beyond itself to a deeper spiritual reality.